Hello, and welcome to the Microlabels series, the video on gender microlabels. So, before we get started talking about gender microlabels, how they're defined, what they mean, all of that, I want to talk a little bit about what gender means when only a few people really identify with that gender. So, a lot of these gender microlabels, as we said, they are micro, they're very small, and they're not widely known or recognized in society. But in the last video, we talked about how gender is societally constructed. We define and recognize what a woman is when someone performs womanhood and someone else recognizes that as womanhood. Some credit to Judith Butler for that performative theory of gender. But when your gender is, for example, for me, I am gender queer. When I perform that, probably no one in the wider public is seeing me and without me telling them, just automatically recognizing that as genderqueer, as a performance of genderqueerness. Because of that, gender microlabels are a little odd. So the traditional binary genders that are common in my culture, man and woman, are generally defined more or less by a big conglomerate of associations. So there's the association with sex assigned at birth, there's the association with a variety of behaviors, traits, characteristics, inanimate objects, colors. Everything feels like it aligns somewhere on a masculine to feminine spectrum. And so this ideology of womanhood with sex assigned at birth and the associations of femininity is a gender, but that kind of cultural hegemony doesn't totally translate when we're talking about microlabels. So, a lot of these are defined just by whoever does not vibe with masculinity and manhood or femininity and womanhood and is trying to elaborate upon their own personal experiences and their personal understanding of how they understand, experience, and navigate gender. As such, these labels are not set in stone. To be fair, neither is manhood or womanhood. It can vary across culture. But this can vary from person to person. So you can have two people who identify as genderqueer, but their experiences of gender and what that means to them can be vastly different. As such, I'm going to do my very best to describe my best description of a vague consensus of what these labels mean. But I want to preface that by saying, if someone tells you they identify with one of these labels, don't assume that their experience aligns with the description I'm giving you here. Ask them about it. If they're open to talk about it, then find out what that means for them, because it's different for every person. And even if their experience does align with the description that I give here, it's probably better to just talk it out anyway. It's a good, interesting topic. But if you see these labels used in passing, online, or what have you, then it's nice to have a general idea of what the person might probably be talking about when they're referencing it. So here we go. I have these in order of the alphabet. So, of course, we start off with agender, which is a label I have used in the past, and it generally means there is no gender here. No gender to be seen, no gender. And it can also kind of mean a neutral gender, or a gender that doesn't really align any particular way. This is also kind of a rejection of the assignment of masculinity and femininity to otherwise neutral things. So there's an assumption that if you enjoy knitting, that's a feminine hobby. Someone who's agender might say, nope, that's a genderless hobby because hobbies don't have genders. And their identity as a gender might influence how they interact with gendered constructs in our society. And for me personally, I found that it also related to my experiences of dysphoria. So I felt uncomfortable in my body, and I would rather have no sexual characteristics whatsoever, primary or secondary, just nothing to see here. And that's what would make me comfortable. And I felt like agender might be a good descriptor of that because of the frequent association of gender and sex assigned at birth. No gender, no sex assigned at birth, none of that. I would like none of it. And so that's agender. I'm going to pause this and plug in my phone. All right, we're good to move on. Another identity that is actually quite old. It has its roots in Victorian culture, if the sources that I have read on the internet, on the non-binary Wikipedia, are accurate, which I cannot say, and I haven't done any more reading on it. So if you want to check this out and try and confirm that, super cool. If you don't, make sure you qualify it like I'm doing with, I'm not entirely sure of the veracity of this claim. But androgen sometimes refers to an intersex identity, but it can also refer to non-intersex gender nonconformity. So in particular, people for a very long time, probably forever, have realized that occasionally infants are born that aren't really, they don't align with the male or female sex. They are something in between, or both, or what have you. And so the medical term for this is intersex. Intersex is also an identity. So some people who are born intersex may go on to identify as male or female, or they may identify as intersex or a non-binary identity. So androgen is an identity that was used to describe intersex people, but also sometimes individuals would identify that way, and they would say it would be because of some invisible intersex condition. And while it is absolutely true that plenty of individuals who are intersex may not be visibly intersex from birth, it does seem like kind of a proto-non-binary identity to say something non-visible about me is neither male or female. And it can also be kind of, from what I read, used to describe a certain sense of gender nonconformity. Next one on the list is autigender. So I talked about this in the Queer It's Complicated video, because I identify as autigender, and it's a term that not many people know about. It is, and I'm sorry for the dogs in the background, it is an identity describing a relationship with gender that is heavily influenced by a neurodivergent identity. So it is true that autistic people are more likely to identify as not cis, and the source for that should be in the Queer It's Complicated video's description. And so, as such, it seems like there's something about autism and neurodivergent identities that have some influence on gender and how we conceptualize and perform gender. In part, this can be described as gender being a social construct, and neurodivergent people are notoriously not great at social constructs. So there's that. But it's also just a personal sort of label, and it's different for every autistic person that uses it. So again, highly recommend asking someone about their personal experiences if they want to talk about their identity. So there is bigender up next. This is a microlabel that is frequently used to describe feeling like the identity of both male and female at the same time, having them both, or sometimes fluid. But it can also be a combo of any two different genders. So for example, someone might feel male and non-binary, or woman and non-binary, or two different non-binary identities. It can mean a lot of things. Again, ask whoever's using it what that means to them. Next up is the demi group. So there are 3 different labels commonly used with a prefix of demi: demi boy, demi gender, and demi girl. So these generally conceptualize gender as, you know, this kind of amorphous thing where you can be kind of in proximity to womanhood, but not really fit with it. And that would be demi girl. You could be in proximity to manhood, but it doesn't really fit, demi boy. Or somewhere between identifying with a gender and being kind of agender, and somewhere in between that would be demi gender, where it's like there's sort of an identity of gender, sort of, but it doesn't quite fit. Gender fluid can describe a gender identity that shifts over time. So some individuals who are gender fluid may identify as a man one day and a woman the next, but some individuals who identify as gender fluid may identify as a woman for years or a man for years, and each person has their own experience of how, I guess, viscous their gender fluidity is, how quickly that flows, and sort of where their gender goes. Some people who are gender fluid may switch between identifying more with womanhood or identifying more with non-binaryhood. Someone who's gender fluid may never identify as a man, and they could still be gender fluid, or never identify as a woman, still be gender fluid. It's a whole thing, and once again, it's always unique to the individual what their particular experience is. Gender flux is a frequently associated with gender fluid. So it's an identity where there is some fluidity. Gender flux is more frequently associated with feeling like usually in one vicinity of a gender, and it doesn't move far from there, but it moves a bit. So for example, someone might vacillate between identifying as a woman or demi-girl, but like maybe a little bit of non-binary, but never too far from that origin. And again, where that origin is, how much they define as flux versus fluid, it's up to the individual identifying as it. Another one is gender fuck, which is, as you might surmise from the expletive, intentionally messing with gender. So someone might intentionally mix gender signals, or they might identify as not adhering to this idea that gender is a real thing, just not participating in the cultural practice of recognizing and performing gender. Next up, gender queer is similar to the gender fuck identity, in that it generally defines itself by its distance from a cisgender norm, but doesn't involve an expletive, which is why I use it, but also just specifically identifies with the idea of queerness, which if you want to learn more about queerness, there's a whole series on that. Gender vague is the next one. It is frequently associated with neurodivergence. It is sometimes described as feeling like gender doesn't totally make sense. It can't be clarified, usually in part or entirely because of some form of neurodivergence. Unlike autigender, this one is less explicitly in the name, neurodivergent oriented, and as such, some non-neurodivergent people may use this to identify, whereas autigender is very autistic specific. If you don't identify as autistic, you wouldn't identify as autigender, whereas gender vague, well, it's more vague. Gray gender is similar to gray sexual, which we'll get into on the A-spec microlabels video. It is sort of a sense of some vagueness in the gender. It's similar to gender vague, but without the connection to neurodivergence. Or it can also be associated with demigender. Next up is multigender. This may be most reminiscent of the discussion on polysexual because it's somewhat similar. So it's feeling like more than one gender. Could be 2, could be 3, could be lots. There's no rules on what genders those are. It's just they're at least more than one gender is being experienced or performed or recognized within this person. So next up, there's non-binary, also typed or communicated with NB, the letters N, B, or NB, E, N, B, Y, to shorten it. A non-binary is an umbrella identity, so anything that isn't man or woman binary can fall under non-binary. Some people identify fully just as non-binary. They don't have any other microlabels. It's just non-binary. It is very much vague and all-encompassing. So if you don't identify as man and you don't identify as a woman, non-binary can cover you. Polygender is very much like multigender. It's more than one gender. Queer can be used to describe a gender identity as well as a sexuality. So queer means not cis and not straight. Or, well, it means not cis and or not straight. So someone who identifies as transgender in any way could identify as queer. Transfeminine is when someone is transgender, so they don't identify with their gender assigned at birth, and their gender experience or their gender presentation or expression aligns with the traditional conceptions of femininity. So someone who is transfeminine may be assigned male at birth and experiences gender in a more feminine way. A trans woman might also identify as transfeminine, but a demigirl might identify as transfeminine. A non-binary person might identify as transfeminine. It's more of an umbrella. Same with transmasculine, exact same thing, but for masculinity rather than femininity. Xenogender is another one where gender ideas or experiences of gender are completely unrelated to masculinity, femininity, manhood, womanhood. It also sometimes involves aspects of sort of aliens or developing new ways of classifying genders. So trying to figure out different ways of identifying genders. In particular, even in our own animal kingdom, we see some species that have a lot more than two genders. And so this can sometimes draw inspiration on that of, well, what do those genders mean? And kind of identifying with that. So last but not least, there are culturally specific identities. So these are identities that are specific to a culture, and people from that culture may identify with this identity. Now, I am not from any of these cultures, and as such, I will give a brief description of what I've read, and then I will provide in the description a link to someone from that culture who has that identity, describing their experiences with that identity, because when you're looking at a culturally specific identity, it's best to hear from someone of that culture who has that identity. So I will get the pronunciation on all of these completely incorrect. Please forgive me, and again, please learn about them from the people who identify with that. So there is Bisu, which is the Bugis people of Indonesia. It's associated with intersex people, but not exclusive to intersex, involved a spiritual role and ritual responsibilities. Fa'afine, from the Samoa culture, assigned male at birth people, assuming feminine roles. The assigned female at birth equivalent goes by several names, including Fa'atane, Fa'atama, and Fa'fatama. There's also the role of Hijra in South Asian countries. This is AMAB, or assigned male at birth, people with feminine gender expression, and a role in religious practice, Hindu or Muslim. There is the Ma'ahu, which is Hawaiian and Tahiti Polynesian culture, non-binary, any assignment at birth. And then there is Two-Spirit, which is the umbrella term for Native American non-binary gender identities. Different cultures have different meanings, practices, and implications, because Native Americans had a lot of different cultures, and a lot of different groups with a lot of different gender norms. So the links for all of those will be in the description. Thank you so much for watching. And last but not least, I want to issue a bit of a challenge. So if you can think of gender, the way we define it in our binary culture, and we assign a whole slew of ideas and characteristics and traits and behaviors to a particular gender, imagine what a third gender would be, not having anything to do with masculinity or femininity. What traits and characteristics and various ideas and behaviors could we take and conglomerate and decide this is another gender? Because that's something that theoretically could happen. Our, excuse me, our culture could just decide that all of these things are masculine, all of these things are feminine, and all of these things are something else, and we can call it whatever we want. And I think it's just an interesting thought experiment and an exercise to think about what would we define that gender around, and what would it look like and how would it be performed. So I will leave you with that exercise, and look forward to talking to you next time, where we will talk about aspec, micro labels, and identities.